This is Jerry Fry, audio historian of the Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. The following is the professional history of a PPB member told by himself in his own fashion on this February the 10th of 2014. These interviews are being recorded in order to compile firsthand a living history of the members of our organization and the stories of their professional experiences. Many of our members began in what is called the golden age of radio and television, and this is an attempt to preserve as much data as possible for succeeding generations. This recording is not intended for broadcast without first obtaining permission from Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. And with me today in Studio City, California, at the CBS Studio Center, is Bill Moran. Bill's a member of our board of directors and been with the organization for a couple of years now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Bill, we usually start these things by asking you when and where were you born and how did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada.
Another Canadian.
Oh, yeah, and a lot of entertainment there. And But with the bad weather we're experiencing on the East Coast right now, Winnipeg is used to it. They have it all the time. I've been in 30 below zero weather, so I know what cold weather is.
Sure.
I was 14 when we moved to Los Angeles.
And how did you grow up? Your mother and father were what?
Well, they were. My mother was born in the United States, and my father came over from Europe.
And what profession were they in?
My mother was basically a homemaker, and my dad was involved in selling. He was a terrific salesman.
Great.
And particularly in the grocery field.
He came over from Europe?
Yeah, from Europe.
May I assume Moran is a...
Actually, my original name was Morans. It changed when we became American citizens. Changed it from Morans to Moran.
Any relation to the famous Morant's electronic equipment?
I know who they are,
Yeah.
but no. I certainly know who they are.
No income from that source?
Oh, no, I wish I had some from them, yeah.
Indeed.
Especially in those early years.
Sure. Tell us about your growing up. What did you do? You went to school, obviously. And then
Yeah, I went to school in Winnipeg, and I was very interested in sports. I was particularly interested in baseball. Loved the New York Yankees. Loved listening to Mel Allen, who was the voice of the Yankees. Although, in looking back, Vin Scully, of course, to me is the idol.
Right.
But I had a normal childhood in Winnipeg. A lot of family members there. And so when we made our move to Los Angeles in 1954 or 55, it was quite a change. But we wanted to move here because we wanted a warm climate. Winnipeg is far from a warm climate.
Right.
And so I had a wonderful time here in Los Angeles and love it here.
What did you study in high school?
Well, I wanted to, at one time, I wanted to be a singer, believe it or not. I was involved in some of the musicals, but, and I was interested in the whole world of show business. That's really what grabbed me. Ultimately, I realized I was not going to be the next Sinatra, but on the same token, I did enjoy music, and show business was, as a matter of fact, I remember in those early years, I had a desire some way, somehow, to be in front of a microphone. Even then.
Did you have some radio idols of yours?
Besides
Sinatra, I suppose, was one.
Well, as far as the music side, Sinatra was I liked Eddie Fisher, believe it or not. I really enjoyed him.
I do, yeah.
I enjoyed him, and I had some fun. I remember at our high school reunion in L.A., I emceed the event, and I almost felt like I was Monty Hall doing Let's Make a Deal, but we were not making any deals. I was just getting stories from people, and they were playing music that tied into that time period, which would be the late 50s.
Okay. So you came right from Winnipeg to L.A.
Right to L.A.
What determined the L.A.?
Well, first of all, my mom had some health issues, and she needed a warmer climate. The other city under consideration was Dallas, and I tried to poo-poo that, and I was able to do that. And L.A., there were some people she knew here. That my mom knew here. And L.A., of course, when you think about the 1950s, it was the Golden State.
Sure.
Everybody wanted to be here, and I looked around and I thought back to those good old days of what you heard on the radio, what you saw on TV. This is the place I wanted to be. There was no way I could have made it staying in Canada, although there are people who have, obviously, Lauren Green being a good example, Monty Hall being a good example. Monty Hall being from my home city of Winnipeg.
Right. More people now from Canada, it seems to me, than there were back in the 50s.
Oh yeah, including some pretty big stars in music. A lot of major stars
Yeah.
in music are right from Canada. A lot from Toronto, some from Montreal, and some from Vancouver.
Justin Bieber being one.
Yeah, well, I like to get rid of him quickly.
Oh boy. Okay, so you came to L.A. At 14, you said?
Yeah, I was about 14, 15,
14.
yeah.
So you were into high school by then?
Yeah, I did a lot of high school debate.
Did
I
you?
loved debating. And I had in fact, I had a very terrific debate coach. And I enjoyed it because, again, you're in front of an audience, you have to think on your feet. And one of my debate partners was Ted Jones, who was the son of the late Lena Horne.
Oh, really?
So that was an interesting time.
For heaven's sake.
And yet, years later, he was dead when there was a reunion.
Gee.
And there was all kinds of speculation as to why, what happened.
Yeah, yeah. So in high school, besides debate, did you do anything in the dramatic line, or was there a radio outlet for you?
No,
or-
there was no radio outlet. I did some music stuff, but there was no radio outlet. I think where it began, where UCLA was pretty important to me, because I remember as I was well on at UCLA, I was extremely interested in looking some way somehow at getting into the entertainment industry. And UCLA had a posting for a summer job working at Billboard magazine. I don't know if you remember Whitefront, the Whitefront stores from years
sure.
ago.
Yeah.
Okay. What happened is there was a Christmas catalog that they were out to sell product in, showcasing product for the holidays. And I got hired to sell, and they hired somebody in New York and they hired somebody in the South to cover the country. And what I did was basically made the impact there with Billboard. That was my opening. And Lee Zito, who was the editor-in-chief back then, was kind of impressed by what he saw because I outsold the other two territories 3-1.
Oh, wow.
And so they offered me a job at Billboard. And that was the beginning of my entree into professional entertainment.
And you were what age at that point?
Oh, boy, that had to be, I guess, in my 20s, early 20s.
So you got out of high school and went into UCLA
I went to UCLA and
to study what?
I was a poli-sci major, political science, with a speech minor. And I had used speech. As a matter of fact, I became a student teacher, and I used speech effectively to really influence people, to get them to not be afraid of audiences, to get them to be able to talk about things they're interested in. It's one thing when you're dealing with a youngster who's afraid of a crowd, who's afraid to stand in front of people. It's one thing if you're asking him to talk about politics and what happened in the Franklin Roosevelt as compared to saying, what do you think of the Dodgers? Who's your favorite player? Who's your favorite football player? Things they're interested in. That's the way you break them, and that's what happened. But UCLA was basically the door opener for me.
Did you debate in UCLA as well?
No, I did not. No, I didn't do that at all. I had taught courses, and there, some certain elements of. As a matter of fact, later on, I dealt with UCLA Extension and taught broadcasting, but that was much later on.
Sure. How about your first radio job? How did you get into radio?
Okay, the way I got into radio, first of all, I was working at Billboard magazine. I pick up the phone. First of all, what I did is I called Ron McCoy at KFI. I don't know if you remember him years and years ago. He did the late night show on KFI. And I called him up. And again, I'm representing Billboard. So he calls me back. And I said, listen, I had a question for you. Are you interested in reaching out for younger demographics? That's the word everybody knows, younger demographics. And I said, how would you like to do music trivia on your late night show? Who had more #1 records? Who had more #1 albums? Where did this one go on the Billboard chart? Where did the other one go? He put me on the air as a guest. I did it with him on KFI, and I did it with Ron Owens on KGO up in San Francisco. I wanted to go on there. I wanted to see how comfortable I would be in front of a microphone, and it was a snap for me. The lines were lit up. If you can imagine, KFI's signal was unbelievable.
Yeah.
And that opened the doors, because once that happened, then I picked up the phone and I called Jim Simon, who at that time was the program director at KABC, which then was a monster station, unlike what they are now.
Yeah.
They had a tremendous lineup of people. If you think back to when Michael Jackson was on there and Ray Bream was on there, and he, of course, was a big member of Pacific Pioneers, as you know.
Indeed.
They had Carol Hemingway, And so I put a call into KBC, and Jim Simon called me back. And he said, Bill, you're with Billboard. And I said, yes, and I'd love to take a shot at KBC. And I threw some ideas at him. He said, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to have you as a guest on the Carol Hemingway show. And she was quite liberal, if you remember her. Mm-hmm. And she called me up and she said, I don't know who you are, but I've been told we have to have you on the air. And after she talked to me for 5 minutes, she said, I'm not worried about you at all. She said, we'll do a show. We'll talk about the industry. And she called me to be on the night of the Grammy Awards.
Oh, my God.
Which was not a good idea.
No.
Because, but what I did was I called New York, my contacts in New York, because the Grammys are a tape delay out here. Unlike the Academy Awards, they're a tape delay out here.
Right.
And so I got all the winners. We go on the air. At 7 o'clock, she tries me, and boom, we blow it wide open. Then they said to me, Bill, we like what you did. If you can deliver a superstar guest, like you said you can do, you'll fill in for her for 3 weeks, beginning with the first show. And so I'm calling around, and I called Dick Clark, and I called a lot of people that I knew. And everybody initially said, well, we're glad you got the show, but, we haven't got anything to plug. So then I called Dick Clark back, and he comes to the phone, and he says, Bill Moran, you son of a, here is, when do you need me? And I said, I need you Saturday night. What time is the show on KBC? And I said, it's from 7 to 10. He said, I'll give you 90 minutes. So I called Jim Simon, the program director at KBC, and I said, I've got Dick Clark. And he said, you got Dick Clark? You're on the air.
Now, how did you know Dick Clark?
I knew Dick Clark because of all the years at Billboard magazine.
Ah.
I mean, I had all that experience. I was with Billboard a lot of years.
What was your job there with Billboard?
Well, I was involved in advertising, in a lot of advertising. I did very special issues. We did tributes to Sinatra, and I called people like Duke Ellington. I got on the phone in Rome, and he took an ad on Sinatra. Tony Bennett took one on Sinatra. Richard Conte, Sammy Kahn, Jimmy Van Heusen. You know a lot of those names.
Yeah.
And Sinatra was a blowout, and I did a lot of specials for them. So I had all that experience at Billboard. I did some writing for them as well.
For 15 years.
I was there from from 64 to 1978, and then after that, Billboard magazine became a client of mine. So I was really wired in there. Really, Billboard was definitely a training tool for me. It gave me all kinds of opportunities.
And terrific contacts.
And tremendous contacts. It gave me an opportunity, for instance, my grandfather was living in Winnipeg, and he was like in his 70s, almost 80 years old. He was living at the Jewish Old Folks Home in Winnipeg. And of course, I was very close to him. In fact, the last time I had seen him, I took him to a movie there where Bing Crosby and Jane Wyman were in Here Comes the Groom. I don't know if you remember that movie.
Oh, yes.
Jane Wyman was in it.
Yeah.
And what I basically did, he came out here with some family members and stayed in my home, and I called Lucille Ball's husband. This is when they were taping Here's Lucy right at CBS. And I called him up. Again, it's Billboard. He calls me back, and I said, my grandfather, I just have to tell you, my grandfather worships your wife more than even you do. And is there any way we can come to a taping of Here's Lucy? And he said, give me a couple of days. He called me back, and we were there in the very first row.
With your grandmother?
With my grandfather.
Father.
Because my grandmother had died.
Yes.
And my grandfather is going crazy. I mean, you can imagine. There's his idol. There's Lucille Ball out there. Gary Morton was the husband. And he's the one that set it all up in the very, very first row. The taping is over, and Lucille Ball comes over and says, where's the grandfather? And she sees him, and she lifts him up because they had a table right on stage. She put him on the table and started kissing and hugging him and pointed to the CBS camera guys and said, take as many shots as you want. We want, and of course, that to me is a good example of where contacts can work, especially when you're dealing with very nice people.
And did your grandfather survive that?
Oh, he just went nuts. And then he got a picture of it, of course, and he took it back to where he lived in Winnipeg.
Sure.
So that's something I'll always, but that was, I used the contacts. Billboard was definitely a opener, but you had to know what you're doing. You had to be prepared. And then they said, okay, Dick Clark. So the first show I ever did on the radio as a host of a show had Dick Clark on there, had Marty Klein. if you know who he was. He was the founder of the Agency for Performing Arts. And back then he had Johnny Cash, he had Steve Martin, he had some big, big clients. And I developed a very strong relationship with him. And he said to me when I called him up, "This is your first show?" He said, "Boy, this is the first show." I don't know. He said, "Who do you have booked?" I said, "Dick Clark." He said to me, "What time is the show?" He said, "I'll be there." He followed because before he had done this, before he was heading an agency, he did a child's TV show, talk show.
Really?
And so he had the experience.
Sure.
And then we did a whole thing with Vegas. I had somebody on from Vegas talking about how you package deals and how you put stars together and inside the world of an agent. And it was a blockbuster. Then they said, "Okay, you got the show. The following week, what are you going to bring in?" "I'm going to bring in Glenn Campbell." And this was the time in the mid-'70s where Glenn Campbell was red hot with Rhinestone Cowboy by the time they get to Phoenix. And then the following week we had Telly Savalas. That was the time of Kojak.
Oh, yeah.
You remember? So
Sure.
that was the beginning. KBC was the absolute beginning.
Wow.
What a way to start.
What a way to start is right.
I mean, today you could never do that.
No.
Today UCLA, it wouldn't happen. It just wouldn't happen. But you have to know how to prepare for it.
Yeah.
And if you say you can deliver, you better deliver.
Oh.
And you better be ready to deliver. Otherwise, you're blowing a chance.
Yeah. Once you don't deliver, then it's tough to climb back up again.
And remember how powerful KBC was. They were a dominant. They were the top. Ben Hoberman was the. If you know his background,
Yes.
he was absolutely the father of talk radio. He knew what he was doing.
Right.
Unlike where KBC is now. And a lot of it was local programming. Most of it was local programming. Michael Jackson and those people, Ray Bream, tremendous talents, Carol Hemingway. And they had experts in every field. And what a way for me to break in. It was a tremendous way to break in.
But they eventually went national, didn't they? Ray did, I know.
Well, Ray did, but it didn't last very long, though.
Yeah, a few years, a
It
couple
did-
years.
Yeah, it didn't last very long. See, Ray Bream, to me, was entertaining talk radio. What I liked about him, and people didn't even realize that his background was music. He was a disc jockey,
Yes, he was.
and a damn good one. And he was one of the guys that I was very, very close to there. And Michael Jackson, too. I mean, Michael Jackson was, when I was in high school out here, he was a guest speaker at LA High when I was there. He came in and talked to the students. So that was a fun time for me. That opened it up. And then from there, of course, we can carry it wherever you want to carry it. Okay.
So, well, that's certainly a way to get going.
I don't think that would happen today unless nepotism plays a role, which obviously it does
Yeah.
for people.
No. In this business?
Yeah.
Come on, Joe.
Plenty of it. Yeah. Plenty of
Oh,
it.
man. So you came out of UCLA with a degree and
Well, I was a political science major.
Political science,
Yeah, poli-sci, and
yeah.
speech was my minor.
okay.
And then later on I went to Berkeley, and up in Berkeley I became very, very close with Mort Saul, very, very funny guy. You know Mort.
Yeah.
He did a lot of stuff up there, and I did some stuff with him. And of course, that was back in the days of the Hungry Eye. And I remember up there we did shows with John Fogerty. Clearwater Revival was big at the time. So Berkeley was a good place for me, and I graduated from there and then came back to UCLA.
I wondered what your connection was with the Bay Area you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I was at one time I wanted to be a law student, and I was that bold for a while, but I didn't stay with it. My heart was always to be in the entertainment industry. I was just looking for a way to get it. Where I scored big was in the advertising marketing area, because in that area it's more objective than subjective. I mean, what I mean by that is if you deliver, you're going to win.
Sure.
Whereas when you're dealing on some, even if you're successful with radio or for TV, it's all driven to some degree by money, but there's a lot of politics that plays a role in it too. There's no question. I mean, some of the things that are going on right now in radio, there's a huge difference when you take a look at what KFI is doing now and what KABC is doing now.
Yes.
And monopoly isn't always the best thing. Mergers are not always the best thing.
Well, you were there when the payola business happened.
Oh yeah.
You probably know all about that.
Yeah, I certainly know quite a bit about it, but Dick Clark, of course, was controversial at that time, but Dick Clark had the right image.
Yeah.
He had the right image. I knew a lot of people But of course, radio was localized back in those days. Today it would be much more difficult for that to happen.
Sure.
I mean, every week the guys would come in there from the record companies and obviously would display the current records and want to get them played on the radio.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot different now than it was then.
Yeah.
It's a lot different now. And, you know, for me, one of the things that happened, one of the stations that I went with were the people that owned Kiss AM and FM, different call letters then. Mm-hmm. But I got a talk show on Kiss AM, and I did a talk radio program that was public affairs oriented, but I also did entertainment. Did a 4-hour weekly show on Kiss AM, and among the, I would have on one show, I had Tony Bennett in the studio, mm-hmm. I had Bowser of Sean on Ah, and I had the members of Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth, all on the same program in different hours. And we blew the boards out.
Boy, I guess.
Because back in those days, you could hear New York, New York by Frank Sinatra, and you could hear the Knack doing My Sharona. Today, that would never happen. Mm-hmm. So they gave me the freedom to book the acts that and I had no trouble getting the biggest acts. Mm-hmm. And over at KABC, when I started the show at KABC, I had people like Stevie Wonder coming in. We had Johnny Mathis. We had Johnny Mathis, Tony Orlando, and Charo all on together.
Wow.
I mean, I did a lot of wonderful things because I had the freedom to do it, and I had the access to it. I knew the managers and the agents that you had to know, and then you develop the relationships. I think today it's different because today people are scared of their own shadows today. Mm. I mean, the way it is today, Carol O'Connor, All in the Family, I don't think would get on the air.
What hours were you on the air at KABC?
We were on the air in and around Dodger baseball.
Ah.
How's that?
Not bad.
That's not bad. And I'm a huge baseball fan, so I had no trouble with that.
Tied right in.
Yeah, and then when we wound up at KFI, they gave me 12 o'clock to 4 a.m., and then they switched me 8 o'clock to midnight on Saturday nights. And we had some tremendous guests on KFI. Mm-hmm. The Booming Signal, 50,000-watt clear channel. Mm-hmm. We had people like, that was from the late 1980s, to like 1991, 92. Michael Feinstein came in there wearing a tuxedo after just doing a show at the Hollywood Bowl. Uh-huh. I had relationships. He came in and did the show. Mm-hmm. Richard Dreyfuss coming in and doing the show, where I was told he wanted to talk about relationships with Israel and the Middle East, because at that time he was set up through the Jewish TV network wanted him to come on with me. But I got him through Disney because I knew the key people at the Walt Disney Company. Uh-huh. He came on the air with me, and the first thing I asked him was about the Holocaust. Are there too many Holocaust films? And I said, and we talked about, Schindler's List and some of the other things. Mm-hmm. And basically, Dreyfuss was a blowout, and he said to me, you know what, I like the approach you're making. Ask me anything you want to ask me. Yeah, I'll talk about Spielberg. I'll talk about Hollywood, how it's changed. And you need to be off a script in order for talk radio to work. Yeah. You need to be off a script, especially when you're dealing with guests, because they've already got their own set agenda, and they've said the same story a million times.
Sure.
And you have to be different. And I think we were. I did hard edge entertainment journalism. That's what I did, which I don't think you have today.
No, I can't think of any.
I mean, today it's all gossip.
Yeah.
It's all gossip today, and. So KFI was a good experience. We were on KGIL, too, with Mike Lundy, and he hired me, and we did a whole series of shows there. Mm-hmm. But the two that were the most fun, I would say, were KABC, because they were number one at the time. KFI, of course, was building. This was when the format was changing, and Rush Limbaugh was coming in, and all of that. And so those were very, very interesting times for me.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about KFI taking Rush off the air?
I think, first of all, his numbers have dropped a little bit. I think they are looking to become more and more local, and I think it's going to work. First of all, in Bill Handel, they got the most listened to personality English in the LA market. His numbers are astronomical.
Are they really? And
he's got a tremendous news department. That's, I think, is very, very important. Bill Handel is somebody that I knew going way, way back. I like the show that he does. He's a tremendous. Now they have Bill Carroll, who they brought over from Canada, from Toronto, and he follows. And then there's John and Ken. You know who they are. Their numbers are gigantic.
Yeah.
And but I guess what they opted to do was to take 1150, which was K-Talk, and turn it into what they now call the Patriot, which is very conservative radio. And the anchor there is Rush Limbaugh. They got him live. However, in Los Angeles, if you think about it, KFI, 50,000 watts and a gigantic station with big numbers, and K-Talk with very, very small numbers, eliminating a couple of the liberal hosts like Stephanie Miller and so on and so forth, and going with Limbaugh. If you're going to go with somebody strong, he's the guy you go with. And they also have Sean Hannity over there now, too.
That's true.
So they are very conservative and to some degree very right-wing in what they do. And I hate labeling, because one thing I liked about a guy like Michael Jackson is I learned a lot from him and was entertained, and I got both sides of the story.
Is there anybody local over there, though? Are they all network?
A lot of their stuff is pretty much network programming. Yeah, most of it. Not all of it.
Mm-hmm.
They do have some local programming.
Okay.
Yeah. But they have Beck on the air there. That's a national show.
Yeah.
I think in a city like Los Angeles, I think you're much better off if you've got some local elements to it, because this is a very important city. There's news happening here all the time.
Sure.
And you have a lot going on with Hollywood. If you don't think Hollywood plays a big role in politics, in national elections, it plays a tremendous role. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, all that radio is interested in is gossip. They're not interested in hard facts. There's nothing on the air, to my knowledge now, on the radio, that really is the hard-hitting element of Hollywood.
Yeah. Well, John and Ken hit some topics, but from a different point of view, I guess.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I remember, because I do some work. I do some work for the LA Press Club. I do the Golden Mike Awards. I'm involved with a lot of radio stuff. Mm-hmm. This, in addition to being on the radio, and what I find is that when you look at what's going on today, I mean, to me it's disturbing. It's disturbing when you watch newscasts and when you put the radio on and you hear this story with this kid that what is he now, 18 years of age, and got all the money in the world and running around with the mayor of Toronto. Mm-hmm. Who cares? I mean, who cares? And I think it's demeaning to a lot of local news to give it that much attention. There's so much going on in the world and we're not getting it.
That's right.
That's my opinion.
Good opinion, I think. You have been in the business now how many years?
We started in as far as mid-70s. Mid-70s. That's when it all in terms of being on the radio.
Right.
In the mid-70s. In terms of being in the industry, in the 60s.
Yeah.
With the very first job actually being Billboard magazine, which is also unheard of. And back then, Billboard was a giant. It was the most important publication.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of the music industry. Mm-hmm. And in terms of and I had a lot of opportunities there to meet a lot of very important people, including being involved with the Paul McCartney people when he went out on his tours. His very first tour that he did solo was back in 1991, and I got hired by his management team to help them put a program together that was given out to everybody who crossed the turnstiles in the United States and around the world. They had a free program, and what they wanted me to do was sell 20 pages of advertising centered around with the tour, and you can imagine what that experience was like, especially when the kind of audiences he played to.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting experience, and it was Madonna's manager who knew me who made the recommendation to the management people in London that they ought to hire me. And I remember they told me, when I said I was interested, I met with the management, and I thought when I met them at the Polo Lounge that the meeting was going to be a suit and tie kind of meeting, but it wasn't. Mm-hmm. They came in blue jeans.
Oh, but
that's just the nature of the game.
I'll bet you were involved in a Billboard conference I attended in about 1972 maybe, at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco.
I've been to a lot of them. You're going to have to tell me what that was about. I can't remember that one.
Well, it was for broadcast, for radio people, and a lot of disc jockeys were there, and panel discussions. And that
oh yeah, we did a lot of those.
Yeah,
we did a lot of those. In fact, I put together a talent. I was one of the people involved with a talent forum they had, and I had as one of my key people Paul Anka, who was one of the most articulate guys you'd ever want to talk to, and extremely opinionated. Oh boy, the stuff he would tell you, he was straight on. And we had Barbara Mandrell back then. She was a pretty hot property.
Yeah.
And those Billboard events were very, very strong. Billboard was extremely influential. I think what happens, though, when you get big and bigger and when you get outside elements playing in, you lose it. And today they really don't have anywhere near the influence they used to have.
No, they don't seem to, do they?
No, they don't. But, I mean, people still talk about charts,
Yeah.
number one records, but it's all in the past. It isn't what it is now. A number one album now, you can sell 100,000 copies and be a number one album. Back then, you'd sell it in the millions.
Yes.
That's your difference.
Yeah.
That's your difference. But it was an exciting time. And then we went national a little bit. We went with the Business Talk Radio, and of course with Michael Harrison and Talkers Magazine, which is extremely influential in terms of radio today. Extremely influential, especially as it relates to news and talk. And I'm very much involved with them even now.
You mentioned we frequently. Are you working with somebody? Or
No, I always use we. Yeah,
Okay.
it's me. You know, I've had. You know, I've been one of those kind of guys. If you don't go for it, you're not going to get it. It's just short and simple. And you know, I know exactly what my skills are, and what I'm doing now is equally involved with the entertainment industry, with a lot of events that I'm involved with marketing, advertising, and sponsorships. That keeps it alive. One of the things that I'm doing, which in a way has a radio connection to some degree, performing in front of live audiences. Recently, at the American Jewish University, back in November of this year, I called upon Johnny Mathis to come and join me. I know his management, I know him, and he was a guest at the American Jewish University in the Gindi Auditorium there, which seats 500 people, and it was a total sellout. People had an opportunity to see me interviewing him. On the same token, if they wanted to meet him, there was a meet and greet following in another room, and that price was higher. But Johnny Mathis was unbelievable. I got more out of him than I think anybody's ever gotten out of him.
Wow.
He was very candid. But again, when you're in a room, you got 500 people, one of the things I've always noticed is you've got to know the star. You've got to look for elements that will really get him, you got to get him very comfortable with you. But he was comfortable with me right from the very beginning. And so I was able to get stories from him about people like Streisand, Barbara Streisand, and David Foster. And there was one interesting story he told me. I said, I'm looking through the Society of Singers program I was involved with, and there's a picture of you with Jackie Gleason and Groucho Marx. And I'm just kind of curious about what's the story with you and Groucho? What's that story all about? And he said, well, you know, Bill, he said, I was having my car washed at the time, and I was sitting there getting my car washed, and somebody sits right next to me, and it's Groucho Marx. And we're sitting there, and we're not saying anything to each other. And then all of a sudden, Groucho Marx turns to me and says, you know, Johnny, I can sing too. And that's how the conversation began.
I'll be there.
And he had stories about Jackie Gleason. He had stories about Elvis Presley when they were both youngsters and they were not names at the time. And what that whole scene was like, Billy Joel, he had tremendous stories. Because everybody, of course, knew about his relationship with Henry Mancini, his relationship with Andy Williams. Also, you can think about Dinah Shore, who was very, very important to him, who had him on when he had just signed a contract.
Oh, really?
At a very, very young guy. Very, very young. So, I mean, I've had a lot of fun in this business. I've had a tremendous amount of fun. But I've been involved not only with the radio side, but everything around it, too.
Yes.
And when you do a live event like we did Michael Feinstein, who's red hot right now, I did him at the American Jewish University when he had his book out called The Gershwins and Me. And we had a packed house there for that. But the key where he knew me, this goes back to the early years again of radio, when I invited him to come down to the studio to Kiss AM when I had Ella Fitzgerald as a guest. So she's in the studio with me, and we're taking phone calls all over Los Angeles. Nelson Riddle calling in, Count Basie, and we played Mac the Knife, and she's talking about he had a piece of tape on her that she didn't even remember, and we played it on the air. Michael Feinstein was with me for that one. Now think about Ella Fitzgerald. How often have you heard her on the talk radio show?
Yeah.
You didn't.
No.
Bing Crosby. When I did a whole thing on KABC with Bing Crosby, that was thrilling. And he introduces me to Fred Astaire. We taped Bing Crosby. It wasn't live. And then when he went back to his home up north, we put him on live, and we put the plugs in during commercial breaks of the taped interview with him. And one woman calls up and says, "Dear Bingo," she said, "God, Bing, oh, dear Bingo." She said, "I'm going to hang up now and have my stroke." She was so thrilled. We had Barry Manilow, we had Neil Diamond. I mean, we had so many people, giant names. You don't hear them now, and when you do, they're basically on TV, and they're plugging something. They never did that with Johnny Carson, but that's what they do now.
You never had a music show per se.
It was music that got me on there.
Yeah.
It was music that got me.
You never played records.
Oh, I could. I could play a little bit of music. If I had a Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet on, even on the rock side, I mean, I had Ozzy Osbourne on. I had Alice Cooper on. I had some of the big rock stars as well, and I could play a little bit of bits and pieces, but not a complete track. Right. All the way through, because there were limitations as to what you could use back at the time. Oh yeah, but those were interesting times. I mean, I think back to Mel Torme was another one. Mel Torme was an incredible guest, one of the most candid people I've ever heard on the radio. Stories that he told about Judy Garland. And obviously, you know, he was very much a part of her TV show.
Sure.
That came right here at CBS.
Okay, tell all of those stories.
Well, I mean, the stories that he would tell about her, I mean, nothing out of school.
Yeah.
You know, that she was difficult, but he was just enamored of her talent. I got to know the people around her pretty well, I'll tell you that. I mean, the musical conductor, she was tough. She was tough. And recently, I ran into, because for Pacific Pioneers, remember when we had the luncheon for Michael Feinstein? And I helped put that together with Chuck Street, and I knew a lot of the people. I knew Michael. I was able to get him to say yes. And when we put the panel together, I remember I'm watching the PBS Michael Feinstein special, and who was on there but Mrs. Jean Kelly, Patricia Kelly. Right. Well, I didn't fool around. I immediately got her number, and I called her, and I said to her, and this is how you get guests too, by the way. I said, I just got to call you, Patricia, and admire what you have just done with Michael Feinstein. She said, I didn't even know it had aired. She said, I was hopeful that it wouldn't hit the cutting room floor. I said, it not only didn't hit the cutting room floor, but you were brilliant. I love the way you analyzed your late husband, the way you talked about him, the way you told me stories that I never knew about him. I'm telling you, you were dynamite. And I'm asking you this. Michael Feinstein's going to be at Pacific Pioneers, and I want you on that panel. Can we have you? She said, what day is it? She said, well, I'm doing an event, I'm doing a show saluting Gene that very night out in Orange County, but she said, what time is it? And I told her, she said, I'm going to be there. And that's how you do it.
Yeah, that's terrific.
I mean, that's how you do it.
Great tie-in.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And she was, if you remember, she was
very good.
She was extremely good, and she's doing all kinds of stuff about him now.
And I saw the TV show as well, so I know
so you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And that's what you need to do. But music has been an important part of my life. The Grammys were extremely important to me. We did the National Grammy Show. Michael Harrison and I were executive producers of the Grammy Show, and that was on radio.
Yeah.
And that was before Premier Radio was involved with it. That was MJI Broadcasting.
Before they were televised?
No, this is when they were televised. Yeah, and we were backstage. I mean, remember, I went backstage when they were doing the show at the Shrine, the Grammys, and that's the size of 2 football fields.
Yeah.
When you go back there, and I interviewed Sting. That was the time when Sting was Sting is still hot, and Stevie Wonder, and there were a lot of people. And Barbra Streisand came back, and I got to tell you something. Being such a huge Streisand fan as I am, my wife was with me, and she pushes me right in front of Streisand, and my body heated up like it was like 100 degrees. I mean, and she was giving an award to Mrs. Ira Gershwin at that time on behalf of Ira.
Sure.
And those were great opportunities. I mean, we did the Grammy show, and and of course the Grammys have become extremely big. The only problem that I see with the Grammys today is it's not what I remembered it as being. It basically is a rock and roll show now, with a little bit of R&B and rap. But in those days, the 3 tenors could win. They could be nominated. In those days, classical artists could win in the major categories. Today, I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's
All off camera.
Oh, absolutely. It's all off camera. Even a guy like Michael Bublé could not make the Grammy show live. And he's a very, very hot performer. He's in the tradition of the Sinatras and the Tony Bennett's, but I don't think he's anywhere near as good, in my opinion.
Yeah. But he's popular.
He's extremely popular and deserved to be on that show. If you're honoring all kinds of music, then honor it.
Yeah.
And what I think the Grammys have become, Barnum and Bailey Circus. They do these wild production numbers, and they combine people, and some of the combinations are very interesting. But if you're the kind of person that remembers Sinatra with Nelson Riddle, Gordon Jenkins, Billy May, Axel Stordahl, you're not going to see that anymore.
No. Nope, those days are gone forever.
They are gone.
Yeah. And now we don't even have a live orchestra on Dancing with the Stars anymore.
That's right. That's going to change, isn't it?
Yeah, it's going to become an electronic.
Yeah. See, that to me loses a lot. And even Broadway, because I remember one of the things I remember doing on the radio was over at Saul Levine Station, which was KGIL at the time. I had Sheldon Harnick on, and Sheldon Harnick was the lyricist for Fiddler on the Roof. Now, if you think about that, I remember doing a special also with Billboard on the history of Broadway, and sitting with him at midnight, sitting with Sheldon Harnick and talking about Broadway and how Broadway had changed. And you want to talk about a red-hot show, Fiddler on the Roof is one of the longest-running shows in the history of Broadway.
Yep.
So I've had an opportunity to meet a lot of very exciting people.
Yes, indeed you have.
You know.
And you eventually met somebody that you called your wife now. Where was that, and when did that happen?
Oh, we've been married, we're now in our 49th year. So we're coming in on 50. And it was the old, I guess it was the old Ciro's where people like Clark Gable and Carole Lombard used to hang out. And I went there because they had one of those dances within the, dances, an opportunity to meet people, and I ran into her there. And it all started there.
Really? You ran into her as
she was there with some of her girlfriends. And I spotted her, and I said, "This is for me. I gotta take a shot at this." And then I started talking to her, and
so
then
she used some of your best sales.
I
routines?
did. That was the best sale I ever made. And she says to me, "Well, I can't go again tomorrow night because I've got a date with somebody." I said, "Well, just break the date. This is the Beverly Hilton Hotel, a big event that I'm involved in. See what you can do." So she broke the date, and we go to the event, and guess what? This particular guy was there.
Really?
Yeah. But those things happen. Yeah, that's how I met her. And she played an important role in terms of what I do. She was involved. I remember when we did the Paul McCartney tour, we were involved with that. She played a very important role with that.
Well, terrific.
Yeah.
And children? Obviously you have grandchildren.
We have 2 kids, and a son and a daughter, and we have 7 grandkids.
Are the son and daughter in the business at all?
No, my son has been in the United States military. He was in for 20 years.
Really?
He was involved in Army intelligence.
Okay.
And he lives in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And he had an interesting experience there. I'm very, very proud of what he's accomplished.
Good for him.
And
was he overseas at all?
Oh, he was in Iraq.
Okay.
He was in Afghanistan.
Okay.
He was in the line of battle. He saw it. He saw military guys get killed. But he was involved in Army intelligence, and it's a rough situation, let me tell you, when you experience that. But he was involved in a lot of strategy, and he was there also, remember, in Texas, when where was that, in Fort Hood. He happened to be on the base when he was there when it happened, when they killed 17, 18 people. And fortunately, and he was supposed to be in that very room, but he was going off base, and he found out about it because his kids called him. That's pretty scary.
Yes, it is. It's too close.
Yeah, it's very, very close, and a lot of these military guys have gone through hell. Yeah. Let me tell you, it wasn't a popular war by any stretch. War is never popular.
No, indeed.
But this was not World War I or World War II.
Well, at least he got to be a listener of my old stomping ground, Armed Forces Radio and Television.
Oh, yeah, and I have a lot of respect for what you guys have done. Yeah. What you guys have done. Probably. Tremendous talent. Chuck Southcott, of course, being part of it, too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Charlie Tuna and all those guys.
Yeah, and Charlie Tuna, when you think about him today, here's a guy that to this day is probably the biggest name on the radio in Los Angeles. How many disc jockeys can you think of today that have any name value?
That's right.
And everybody knows who Charlie Tuna is.
And he's worked for every station in town.
Every station in town, every format.
Every format.
Every format musically. And the interesting thing is when you listen to him, the personality comes through.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's not a time and temperature guy.
No.
No.
Yeah.
And there's no voice tracking with Charlie Tuna, I'll tell you that.
That's right. I have the distinct good fortune or bad fortune, depending on how you look at it, to have had to fire Wolfman Jack from Armed Forces Radio.
No kidding. How come?
He was turning in rotten shows.
Yeah.
Terrible quality. We were in those days pressing discs from the tapes.
Yeah.
And his levels were all over the place, and he was putting on stuff that we'd heard 100 times before.
Yeah.
Things that he'd dig up from his. We warned him and warned him and warned him, and he wouldn't listen. So I said, "I'm sorry, we have to let you go."
Yeah, that's too bad. But that's too bad because a lot of times you can take advantage of nice opportunities.
Yeah, it was a free ride for him.
Oh, sure. I mean, he was. But today, what I think today, in reflecting back to KFI. I mean, today they're undergoing a major change there by going with Limbaugh off the air there. But the same token, they have a news department that is a potent news department. I mean, they really have top-notch people doing the news, and they play into the talk show hosts.
Sure.
So they're right there. And if there's an LA connection, they find it. And in a city this large, you need a station like that isn't programmed out of San Antonio where Clear Channel is based.
Right.
Because the minute you're programmed away from here, I just don't think it's the same thing. You've got to know the local community.
No, it's not. And that was one of the things that pained me the most. I had to let all of our disc jockeys go that worked for us in our own studios for the troops and say from now on we're going to take satellite feeds because it was more economical.
And then when you think about again, members of this organization, of Pacific Pioneers, Wink Martindale, there's an example of a tremendous, matter of fact, he was on a radio show that I did on KABC. He was one of my guests when I had Sam Phillips on. Remember Sam Phillips?
Yeah.
And the whole Elvis Presley story? Phillips gave me interviews even after the death. I had tremendous interviews, and Martindale commented on and complimented me on what I had done with Phillips. And Martindale was brilliant on there as well with me. And when you think about what he did on KMPC, when he did the shows with Richard Rodgers and all these great composers, and the Sinatra stuff that he did, he to me was as good as it gets in doing that kind of show.
Right.
And the talent was, and Gary Owens.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, members, I mean, these were really good radio people because they were given the opportunity to perform. They're not given that opportunity anymore.
No. They couldn't make it now, I'm afraid. And
I don't think they could.
They couldn't stand to do it, for one thing.
Right,
because their talent was too big.
Yeah, I mean, and it goes elsewhere now, doesn't it?
Yeah,
It's just like the comedy writing. There was great comedy writing in television's history, whether it's All in the Family, whether it's MASH, whether it's the Mary Tyler Moore Show or Dick Van Dyke. Where is it today in terms of the comedy you get on television today?
Yeah.
I don't see it.
It's not on Saturday Night Live, that's for sure.
No, and yet Lorne Michaels has got a major role in what's happening on NBC.
That's right.
Because he's taken over the nighttime.
Yep.
He's got the two shows at 11:30 and 12:30, and Leno was let go.
Yeah, that'll be very interesting.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to ask you a simple question. You'll be able to answer this right off the top of your head. Who's the most interesting person you've ever worked with?
Worked with or interviewed? Worked with?
Interviewed. Come in contact with.
I think there are three people I think that really get me. I think Richard Dreyfuss was extremely powerful, and again that was hard-hitting stuff where I was able to get political with him, and the stories he told, because he was open. I did not have him go on a memorized script. Yeah. Richard Dreyfuss was fascinating. Paul Anka was another one. And I enjoyed Mel Torme.
Yeah.
I mean, there were others, but I would say, I'll tell you another one, Milton Berle.
Oh, I'll bet.
Okay, Milton Berle at KABC. Now, Milton Berle, the minute you give him a microphone, he's a character. I mean, Milton Berle was probably the most fun I've ever had. Because Milton Berle comes in there and he's doing his shtick. And he's doing his shtick and he's doing stuff. And Bobby Vinton was the next guest scheduled. Now think about this. This is that was in the 70s. Bobby Vinton was pretty hot then, with Blue Velvet and a lot of hits.
Right.
And here's Milton Berle, and he just wants to keep on staying. So Bobby Vinton walks into the studio. Next thing you know, what do we have? We have Milton Berle, Bobby Vinton, and myself. We had a Vegas show. We had a Vegas show, and we had people calling in. You remember Georgie Jessel?
Yeah,
the Toastmaster.
Yeah.
He called in. We had younger people calling in. I mean, we had. I'm telling you, those were the good old days. I mean, KABC with Ben Hoberman, George Green. You know those names. Were to me that was so much fun to do it. So much fun to do it. And I had the same freedom at KFI.
Yeah.
I had the same freedom. I mean, there as well. But KABC was so dominant.
What's their power? What's their radiated power?
KBC?
Yeah.
It's not very strong. I'm not sure, but
5,000?
Yeah, I think so. That
surprised me because I assumed they were a clear channel as well.
But they were so strong in what they did. They had such tremendous. I mean, Bob and Ken in the mornings.
Yeah.
Bob Arthur, remember?
Sure.
I mean, they were. It was just a thrill to be around those people and to learn from those people, and you know, the respect everybody had for one another. KBC was a very, very good radio station, and it covered the stories. Obviously, Bream's point of view would be different than Michael Jackson's point of view.
Absolutely.
But they had mutual respect for one another. That's the difference. Today, so much of talk radio is a war zone, like Congress is, and to me, you don't get enough of people who are really experts in the field in terms of who you're interviewing. Today, it's who can scream the loudest.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, with the way the internet is today and social media is today, there's a lot of times you're not able to really substantiate what you're saying.
You mentioned that Ray Bream had been a music disc jockey prior.
Yeah.
In Armed Forces Radio, he was.
Yeah.
In Japan, he was there when MacArthur was fired.
Oh yeah, that's
And
interesting.
Did he ever tell you that story?
No.
Well, and I know this is true because I've heard it from several sources.
Yeah.
MacArthur didn't know he was fired until he heard it on Armed Forces Radio. The word hadn't gotten to him yet down through channels. So it came out of the Hollywood studios. My predecessor over there had the UPI copy framed on his wall.
Oh wow, wow.
And Bream was working at the station at the time and had to deal with the situation.
He played quite a bit of music.
Yes, he did.
Particularly on Friday nights. That was his night, and he would put whole complete medleys together. He programmed his own music at home. He must have had quite a library.
He did.
And he loved the big band sound. And he did big band remotes. And to see how he made the transition, I guess Joe Pine, was probably the first to really have an impact in terms of late night radio. He was before Ray Bream.
Right.
And do you remember Joe Pine?
Indeed, I do.
Yeah, I mean, those were interesting times. Those were, but look how Ray Bream built his audience, and made late night radio work. I had some experience doing it, filling in for Hilly Rose over at KFI. I had 5 days where I filled in for him, and I brought in Mike Kerb, who that time ran a record company. Of course, then he was lieutenant. Remember when he was lieutenant governor?
Yeah.
Of California. We had Mike Kerb, Glenn Campbell came in, Mac Davis came in. We had some interesting people, but those are interesting times. I respect those guys.
Yeah,
I think today I have an awful lot of respect for Bill Handel. I have a lot of respect for Doug McIntyre.
He's good.
And I think Doug McIntyre is an exceptionally talented guy. And I remember when I put a talk radio panel together, the first one we did at American Jewish University, Bill Handel I called immediately, and he said, yes, he'll do it. And I remember my second call was to Doug McIntyre. And Doug McIntyre said to me, who do you have on the panel? I said, I've only have one person so far. And he said, who is it? I said, Bill Handel. He said, when's the panel? And I told him, he said, I'll be there.
Doug did a wonderful eulogy at Ray Bream's funeral.
I read about it. Yeah, I hear he was great.
Terrific.
And you know what? He did a pretty good. He's done some music stuff too. He's done a lot.
Has he?
Oh, his late night programs where he was heard nationally at night. There was nobody better. And by the way, Ray Bream, of course, was an influence on him. Although his show was a very different kind of show than Ray Bream did.
Oh, of course.
Very, very different. And of course, McIntyre was also married to somebody who was an actress, and he wrote on Married with Children. He was a comedy writer, so his initial stuff was show business. And I think the way he did the late night show, it's a crime that he's still not doing it, because I think the morning drive is difficult when you're dealing with a station that has the kind of ratings that KABC has now, versus KFI, which has got pretty big numbers.
Yeah.
They got more working. They got a huge news department, much bigger than what KABC's is. And you're at a disadvantage, I think. No, I'm a huge fan of McIntyre.
Yeah, terrific.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, I've enjoyed talking with you this afternoon.
Yeah, me too. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Anything that we've left out of your audio history that we need to
I
include?
think we've covered it, and we've had some experience with national shows too, with Michael Harrison and the and talkers, and I'm enjoying doing that as well.
Well, excellent. Keep in there and keep Pacific Pioneer broadcasters going too. Finding some good people to honor at our luncheon.
I love doing that, and I love the people that work here that are a part of it, and I hope it goes on for a long, long time.
I hope so too. We've been speaking with Bill Moran here at the CBS Broadcast Center. Actually, it's the CBS Studio Center, I believe.
Right. Yep.
In Studio City, California, on this 10th day of February, 2014. My name is Jerry Fry. I'm the audio historian for Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters, and thanking you very much for listening.